I'm going to speak a little bit about analytical meditation and what it is, especially in relationship to the Shurangama Sutra. At the city of 10,000 Buddhas and all of Shifu's monastery, Master Xuanhua's monasteries, the practice of and study of the Shurangama Sutra is one of the most common practices and most loved practices of all. The master, Xuanhua, he lectured the Shurangama Sutra every day for an hour and a half for 3.5 years, and twice on weekends, in the afternoon and in the evening. So obviously, in the Cháng school, it is one of the most important sutras. Outside of the Cháng school, which a lot of people are not aware of, but I'm aware of, it also was practiced. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said that it's an excellent practice text. And I'm not surprised because His Holiness the Dalai Lama is a member of the Gelugpa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is largely focused on Nagarjuna's teaching, reasoning, and analysis and debate in Buddhist practice, and developing reasoning and analysis as an art for the attainment of self-realization. In Tibet, there were yogis that practiced the Shurangama mantra exclusively, which is very unusual in Tibet, where many mantras are generally practiced. But there was a group of practitioners that focused on the Shurangama. It's by no means confined to Chinese Buddhism, and happily it's been translated now in several languages, and it's available in a beautiful bound volume, hardbound volume by this organization. Buddhist Text Translation Society has done a beautiful work edited by Ron Epstein and Guozhou Rounds. In practice, from what I've found, and in my own practice, although I've read the Shurangama Sutra, I don't know how many times, many times. I've recorded the entire book 3 times or 4 times, actually 4 times, at least 4 times. And those are available on my YouTube channel. I'm recording a link to them so anybody can download them that wants to listen to those recordings while driving or whatever. It's from beginning to end. And the most recent recording includes the preface and most of the notes. But the point that I want to express today, and I'm going to use myself as an example of how not to practice the Shurangama practice, is to use or rely too much on the mantra itself. In my own practice, the practice of the mantra was very disproportionate to the amount of study I engaged with in the sutra, and the time I spent in analytical meditation, which is actually the principal focus of the Shurangama Sutra. I made the mistake until about 15 years ago, using the Shurangama mantra exclusively as the approach to the Shurangama Sutra. I didn't find out what an extraordinary error this was until about 15 years ago. When reading the Shurangama Sutra, I observed the fact that the dialogues with Ananda, which are basically blueprints for analytical meditation, comprise the better part of the entire sutra. The dialogues with Ananda itself are at least 1/4 of the sutra, although I haven't counted the pages, but all the way up to the mantra, which is past the halfway point. All of the engagements, not only with Ananda, but with other masters, sages, in some form or other is directly related to analytical meditation. Then comes a mantra, which is actually a brief interlude of about 4 or 5 pages. And then the various kinds of demon states that can occur if you make mistakes in your practice or you attach to your practice too much, which is common not just in the Shurangama practice, but in all practices. It's attaching to states. It's warned against in all forms of Buddhism, and even beginners attach to states of mind, and they think they're meditating when they're really just watching their still mind and thinking how wonderful their still mind is. So after they still their mind, they think about how beautiful and still the mind is. So it's just another kind of false thinking. That's difficult to recognize because it's so peaceful. Basically, one is meditating on one's peacefulness, which another is basically a form of attachment. It will never lead to vipassana or insight meditation or deeper meditations. And one can easily get stuck there. So not only beginners, but people get attached to very advanced stages of meditation, samadhis where the breath may stop for an hour, 2 hours, more than that. A friend of mine stopped his breath for 3 days and 3 nights. If we're not careful, we can attach to states such as levitation and so forth. All of these are alluded to in the last portion of the Shurangama, not to attach to states. But the focus of my talk has nothing to do with this particular portion of the text, which is a cautionary. My main focus is the mistake I realized I was making all along about 15 years ago, when one day while I was reading the sutra, it dawned on me that all of these questions that the Buddha is asking Ananda, where does seeing come from? How do you see things? And how do you hear sounds and so forth? What is the location of the mind? And there's many questions that the Buddha asks Ananda which may seem trivial. And I noticed that they did seem trivial, and that's why I never took them seriously. Like rubbing your palms together and, wondering where the heat comes from. It doesn't sound like it's anything so very important. But then I thought to myself, as I was reading this text, that about a third of the text is devoted to these kind of questions. And then the next, almost a third, is devoted to talking to other practitioners, aside from Ananda, how they practice. And a good part of that is all analytical meditation and reasoning. So I did just that. I decided that day that I would try rubbing my palms together, asking myself about the heat and so forth. Where is it coming from? Where does it go? And it was very tedious going, and at the beginning. But then after about a half hour, I started getting really absorbed into the question itself. And what seemed like such a tedious question, and I continued to apply my mind to the question, reasoning as Ananda did, to the Buddha, and using that as a blueprint, and then putting my own inquiry into it, my own words, my own phrases, my own language into the question, same questions the Buddha was asking Ananda. And first day I did it with the hands, and the second day I did it with rubbing the hands, and third or fourth day I did it that way too. And each time I got more absorbed than I ever had before in my meditation. So that's when I realized, well, basically, it shouldn't have been so surprising to me, because I've long known about the question, the classical question, who am I? Which is self-inquiry, the essence of self-inquiry. Who am I? And looking into that. Now that question too seems very trivial, but it's not trivial if you really look into it. If you really apply your mind through analytical meditation, asking yourself, who am I? And you go through all of the ridiculous or seemingly ridiculous answers that you can give to yourself. Just like Ananda did with the Buddha's inquiries, trying his best to answer the Buddha's question, but of course each time he was wrong. But it didn't stop Ananda for a moment, or his enthusiasm. Every time he got it wrong, he tried again. But he didn't stop and think about anything. He just kept going. And this is exemplary how to practice analytical meditation. These questions, and using as a blueprint the questions that the Buddha put to Ananda, those questions about seeing, primarily about seeing, is it's the most available faculty, and that's used the most in inquiry, the method of self-inquiry. But if we use the Buddha's questions as a blueprint for our own inquiry, and try our best to keep a dialogue going with ourselves, which, by the way, is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult if we want to have any logical consistency in our questioning and answering with ourselves, in our dialogue with ourselves, to maintain a steady dialogue that doesn't lapse and we drift off or anything. That's logically consistent from beginning to end for an hour or more. It is very difficult, but it will take one far deeper than the mantra will, far deeper. That's why the Buddha spends about 10 or 20 times as much on analytical meditation throughout the Shurangama Sutra as he does the mantra. The mantra, for me now, is more of a supporting practice, because analytical meditation is very strenuous. It can be very tedious and demanding, but it's much more powerful. And this is no secret. This has been known in Indian Buddhism for a long, long time, that at some point mantra practitioners will have to give up mantra recitation, because it's not going to get them that as far. And this is no secret in any form of Buddhism. I mean, the whole 12 conditioned links of conditioned co-production, Pratisamyutpada, is all about reasoning, analytical meditation and reasoning. Nagarjuna's entire teaching, which is a blueprint for the whole Buddhist canon, is basically analytical meditation and reasoning. And so, to use language properly, I mean, we have our discursive thought, which is basically unconscious thought, which is like a skipping stone that skips along a lake. It never goes very deeply. It stays on the surface and we wander from one thought to the next. That's discursive thinking, but it's musing. It's as the Chinese would say, arguing about the heart and the white. It's just talking about basically things that go nowhere. That same discursive mind that tends to stay on the surface all the time is the same mind through language and words and phrases that, if used in a logically consistent way and employed, rather than us being following around our words and musing about this and that, but employed to stay on topic for an entire meditation session, and see how deeply we can reason out any topic we choose, any of the questions that the Buddha asks Ananda. If we can stay with it, and through original thinking that maintains a structure for the entire meditation session, in that meditation session there will be absorption that is very powerful, and that will take one far further than one can ever think of going with a mantra. And in fact, that one will notice, and I notice, that when I do recite mantras now, I recite them much more effectively than I had previous to using the analytical meditation that is so much suggested in the Shurangama Sutra by the sheer volume of the percentage of the sutra that's devoted to it. Most of the sutra is about that, at least the first half. 90% of the first half of the Shurangama Sutra is about analytical meditation. But you have to give it a try. It's those questions seem trivial until you really give it a try, because all of those questions that the Buddha poses to Ananda will all turn to the central question: who am I? Who is being mindful of the Buddha? And using reasoning to go deep into that question and not lapse into discursive thought, and engage the mind, become engaged in the practice. That will take one very, very, very far in one's meditation. That's why it's there. So, if we don't want to, if we don't want to fail to practice or take advantage of something as obvious as the reasonings in the Shurangama, it's a big mistake, and that's the mistake I found I was making about 15 years back. And my practice, since I started incorporating those questions, it's really gone a lot further. And to me, it's so obvious why in retrospect. But what isn't obvious in retrospect? And the fact is that it's easy to brush off those questions or find them actually trivial, but we're basically being intimidated by the triviality or our response to them as trivial and unapproachable, but they're not. And when you think about it, like, what's really important to ask ourselves is basically things that do seem trivial. How do you see something? You ask anybody that, oh, I see with my eyes. Well, how do you hear it? Well, I hear with my ears. Those are actually good answers. If you keep, okay, if you hear with your ears, then, and you keep going, if you see with your eyes, then, do the eyes discriminate what it sees? Or does it just reveal a form? And then you say, no, the brain reveals the form. Well, how does that happen? You know, and you keep going deeper and deeper until you plug into the question and a kind of absorption takes place. That's what's very healing for the mind. That's what removes the ignorance. And that's what increases one's capacity to really think. Because what we normally do with our mind is not thinking. It's not using language. It's not using words and phrases in a productive, penetrating way that stays on topic throughout a meditation session. So that, if we're going to study the Shurangama, we have to just use our common sense and look at it in that way I'm talking about.